Some legends are born from bloodlines stretching back generations. Others emerge from the fires of conflict, forged through trials and tribulations. But one legend began in a laboratory, grown in a cloning cylinder on a world perpetually shrouded in storms. This is the story of Boba Fett, the most feared bounty hunter the galaxy has ever known, and his journey from a child of science to a man defined by loss, vengeance, and ultimately an unexpected path toward redemption. The story begins not with battles or bounties, but with a transaction, a deal struck between shadows and ambition. Around 32 years before the Battle of Yavin, on the remote ocean world of Kamino, a Sith Lord named Darth Tyrannus approached one of the galaxy's most formidable warriors. Jango Fett was a Mandalorian foundling who had carved out a reputation as the premier bounty hunter of his time. His skills were unmatched. His honor among those in his profession was unquestioned. His armor bore the scars of 1,000 conflicts, and his twin blaster pistols had ended countless lives across the Outer Rim and beyond. Tyrannus made an unusual proposition. The Kaminoans, master cloners who had perfected the science of genetic replication over centuries, required a template for a massive clone army. They needed someone exceptional, someone whose genetic material would produce soldiers of the highest caliber. The payment was substantial, 20 million credits, enough to ensure comfortable retirement on any world in the galaxy. But Jango Fett added one additional condition to seal the agreement. He wanted a single unaltered clone for himself, not a soldier programmed for obedience and accelerated growth, not a mindless warrior destined to follow orders without question. He wanted a son. The Kaminoans agreed. They labeled this special clone with a designation, Alpha. But to Jango Fett, the boy would have a real name, Boba. In the sterile laboratories of Tipoca City, amid the endless rain and crashing waves that defined Kamino's violent weather, Boba Fett came into existence. Unlike the millions of other clones being simultaneously grown in vast halls of transparent cylinders, Boba's development was unmodified. Where the clone troopers received genetic alterations to accelerate their growth and enhance their obedience, Boba remained pure, an exact genetic duplicate of Jango Fett, right down to his DNA sequences, his potential, and his capacity for independence. Life on Kamino was isolated and strange, a world where towering, stilted cities rose above churning seas, where lightning split the perpetual gray skies, and where the clinical precision of Kaminoan science dominated every aspect of existence. For a child, it might have been lonely, but Boba was never truly alone. He had Jango, and Jango was everything. Father, teacher, protector, the foundation upon which Boba would build his entire identity. From his earliest memories, Boba watched his father with the intensity of a student studying a master. Jango moved through the world with a confidence born from decades of survival in the most dangerous profession the galaxy offered. Every gesture carried purpose. Every decision reflected calculated risk assessment. Jango Fett was a warrior poet who wrote his verses in blaster fire and close quarters combat, and young Boba absorbed every lesson with the devotion of an acolyte, learning sacred texts. The training began early, perhaps earlier than most would consider appropriate for a child. But Jango had been raised in the warrior culture of the Mandalorians, where children learned to fight alongside learning to walk. Jango himself had become a foundling after Death Watch murdered his parents, Taken in by the legendary Jaster Muriel and raised according to the old codes, he understood that competence was survival, that skill meant the difference between living to see another sunset or becoming another forgotten corpse on some nameless battlefield. He would not allow his son to be unprepared for the harsh realities of the galaxy. Boba learned to handle blaster pistols before most children mastered basic arithmetic. Jango showed him how to grip the weapon properly, how to account for recoil, how to squeeze the trigger rather than pull it. They practiced in the training facilities beneath Tipoca City, where Jango oversaw aspects of the clone trooper development. The sharp crack of blaster fire became as familiar to Boba as music might be to other children. Target practice evolved from stationary marks to moving holographic projections, from single targets to multiple threats, from ideal conditions to scenarios clouded with smoke or complicated by obstacles. Hand-to-hand combat training followed a similar progression. Jango taught Boba how to fall correctly, how to absorb impact and roll back to his feet. He showed him pressure points on dozens of different species, explaining how physiology varied across the galaxy's diverse populations. A strike that would incapacitate a human might merely annoy a Wookiee. A chokehold effective against a Twi'lek required adjustment for a Duros. Jango drilled these lessons into Boba through repetition and sparring sessions that left the boy bruised but educated. Yet combat skills represented only part of the education. Jango understood that a successful bounty hunter needed more than the ability to shoot straight and throw punches. He taught Boba about strategy, about reading situations and assessing threats before the first shot was fired. They studied star charts together, learning jump routes and hyperlane navigation. Jango explained how to track targets across planetary systems, how to anticipate behavior based on species-specific psychology, how to gather intelligence from informants without revealing your own objectives. The Slave Eye, Jango's battered but formidable Firespray 31 class patrol and attack craft, became Boba's second classroom. The ship had originally been a police vehicle before Jango acquired it through means he rarely discussed in detail. Its hull bore the marks of countless engagements, scorched by blaster fire and scarred by missile impacts. Inside that vessel, surrounded by the hum of engines and the glow of navigational displays, Boba learned to pilot. Jango was patient but demanding, accepting nothing less than excellence. Boba learned to execute hyperspace jumps, to calculate coordinates accounting for gravitational anomalies, to handle the ship's weapon systems and defensive screens. By the time he reached an age when most children were playing with toys, Boba could fly the slave Thra competently enough to escape planetary atmospheres and navigate between star systems. But perhaps the most important lessons were those that went unspoken, absorbed through observation rather than explicit instruction. Boba watched how Jango carried himself, that particular blend of quiet confidence and constant awareness. Jango never relaxed completely, even in the supposed safety of their Camino apartment. His eyes tracked movement in his peripheral vision. His hand never strayed far from his blaster. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried weight. This was the Mandalorian way, or at least Jango's interpretation of it, a philosophy that valued competence over boasting, action over words, survival over sentiment. Occasionally, Jango would take Boba along on bounty hunting missions, though always the safer assignments, jobs where Jango could control most variables. These were invaluable experiences for the boy. He saw his father negotiate with clients, establishing terms and payment schedules. He witnessed how Jango gathered intelligence, cultivating sources and paying for information with carefully measured generosity. Most importantly, he observed how Jango handled the actual captures, the tactical decisions made in real time, the balance between force and restraint, the importance of delivering targets live when contracts specified it. One such mission took them to deliver a captured Twi'lek girl back to her father on a nearby world. During the flight aboard the Slave Eye, Jango and Boba discussed his performance during the assignment. Jango praised certain decisions while critiquing others, always analytical, always teaching. He told Boba that this was the beginning of his legacy, that the Fett name would continue because Boba would carry it forward. For a young boy who had never known any family beyond his father, these words resonated with profound significance. Boba didn't just want to follow in Jango's footsteps. He wanted to be worthy of them. The relationship between father and son was complicated by context. Boba shared Jango's face, would grow to share his voice, carried his genetic code perfectly replicated. Yet Jango never treated him as simply a copy. He acknowledged Boba's individuality, encouraged his questions, allowed him to develop his own approach to problems, even when it differed from Jango's methods. This was not the relationship between a soldier and his commanding officer. This was genuine love, expressed through the only language Jango truly understood, the pedagogy of survival. Outside their private quarters, the relationship between Boba and the clone troopers remained complex and uncomfortable. Thousands upon thousands of men who shared Jango's face filled Kamino's facilities, accelerated to adulthood while Boba grew naturally. They looked at Boba with something approaching curiosity or perhaps envy. Here was a clone allowed to be an individual, to have a childhood, to know his template as a father rather than a distant genetic donor. But Boba felt no kinship with them. They were not his brothers, not in any way that mattered. They were products, manufactured soldiers, while he was Jango Fett's son. The distinction mattered deeply to Boba, even if the genetic reality suggested otherwise. The Kaminoans treated Boba with clinical interest, studying how an unaltered clone developed compared to their modified versions. Prime Minister Lama Su and his assistant Taunwi often observed Boba, taking measurements and recording data. To them, he represented a control subject, a baseline against which to measure the success of their alterations. Boba tolerated their attention, but never warmed to them. The Kaminoans were too cold, too analytical, viewing life as equations to be optimized. They lacked something essential that Boba couldn't quite name, but instinctively recognized as absent. Kamino itself shaped Boba's developing worldview in subtle ways. The planet's isolation from the larger galaxy, the constant storms that battered the stilt cities, the industrial precision of Kaminoan architecture, all of it contributed to a sense that the galaxy was a harsh, unforgiving place where only the prepared survived. There were no soft edges on Kamino, no comfortable illusions. Even the ocean seemed hostile, its waters churning with predators and its depths concealing dangers that occasionally breached the surface to assault the elevated cities. This was a world that demanded respect and constant vigilance, lessons Boba internalized without conscious effort. Despite the harsh environment and rigorous training, there were moments of something approaching normalcy. Jango would tell Boba stories about his own past, carefully edited accounts of missions and adventures. He spoke of distant worlds and exotic species, of space stations hidden in asteroid fields and cantinas where deals were struck in shadows. These stories painted the galaxy as vast and full of possibilities, dangerous but navigable for those with sufficient skill and caution. Boba drank in every word, imagining himself someday traveling to these places, carrying on the tradition his father had established. As Boba grew older, approaching his 10th standard year, subtle changes began manifesting in his relationship with Jango. The training intensified, became more demanding. Jango pushed harder, accepting fewer mistakes, demanding quicker responses, and more sophisticated problem-solving. It was as if Jango sensed something approaching, some deadline that required Boba to advance faster than originally planned. In retrospect, perhaps Jango's instincts warned him that their time together was limited, that the galaxy's chaos would soon intrude upon their isolated existence on Kamino. That intrusion came in the form of a Jedi Knight named Obi-Wan Kenobi. 22 years before the Battle of Yavin, as tensions between the Galactic Republic and the Separatist movement reached critical levels, Jango accepted a contract from his mysterious employer, Tyrannus. The target was Senator Padme Amidala of Naboo, an outspoken opponent of military escalation. Jango subcontracted the actual assassination attempt to Zam Wesell, a shape-shifting Claudite bounty hunter he occasionally partnered with. The attempt failed spectacularly, and when Zam was captured by Jedi protecting the senator, Jango eliminated her with a Kamino saber dart before she could reveal who had hired her. Unfortunately for Jango, the saber dart proved more traceable than anticipated. Obi-Wan Kenobi, investigating the assassination attempt, traced the dart back to Kamino through an old friend with knowledge of the cloning planet. When Kenobi arrived on Kamino, the Kaminoans welcomed him with unsettling enthusiasm, eager to show the Republic what they had prepared. The clone army, they explained, had been commissioned a decade earlier on behalf of a deceased Jedi Master named Sifo Dyas. They had used the finest genetic template available, Jango Fett. Townwee brought Kenobi to the Fett's apartment, where Boba answered the door. The meeting was immediately tense. Boba, now 10 years old, possessed his father's instinctive wariness of potential threats. He looked at the Jedi with undisguised suspicion, recognizing the lightsaber hanging from Kenobi's belt, even if he had never seen one activated. Jango emerged from the interior of the apartment, his demeanor carefully neutral, but his body language screaming caution. Kenobi's questions were probing, but superficially cordial. He asked about the clones, about how Jango had been recruited, about whether Jango had ever heard of Sifo Dyas. Jango provided carefully constructed answers, claiming recruitment by someone named Tyrannus, denying knowledge of Sifo Dyas. Before Kenobi left, Jango spoke to Boba in Fett code, a private language they had developed for tactical communications. The message was clear: prepare to leave immediately. They were compromised, and Jedi meant trouble. After Kenobi departed, Jango and Boba moved with practiced efficiency, gathering weapons and essential equipment. They spoke little, communicating through the shorthand of shared understanding developed over a decade together. Boba knew the routine: They had discussed contingency plans countless times. If discovery came, if their location was compromised, they would reach the slave Vaughn and disappear into the galaxy's vast expanse. It had always been theoretical. Now, it was urgent reality. They made their way to the landing platform where the slave awaited, rain lashing down in sheets, lightning illuminating the gray sky. But Kenobi had anticipated their escape attempt. The Jedi appeared, lightsaber ignited, that distinctive blue blade cutting through the storm's gloom. What followed was one of the most intense combat sequences Boba had ever witnessed. His father fought with every tool in his considerable arsenal, blaster fire forcing Kenobi into defensive maneuvers, wrist-mounted flamethrower turning the rain to steam, whipcord snare seeking to entangle the Jedi's legs. Boba contributed from the slave eye's cockpit, firing the ship's heavy weapons at Kenobi. The cannons tracked the Jedi as he dodged across the platform, his lightsaber deflecting shots that would have killed any normal opponent. For the first time, Boba fully understood why Jango had spoken of Jedi with such caution. This was not an ordinary enemy. This was something fundamentally different, someone who wielded powers that defied normal tactical calculations. The fight progressed across multiple levels of the platform. Kenobi managed to attach a grappling line to Jango, and when Jango activated his jetpack to escape, the Jedi was dragged along, creating a mid-air struggle. Jango cut the line, sending Kenobi plummeting toward the ocean far below, but the Jedi managed to catch himself on a lower platform. Through it all, Boba watched and learned, seeing his father adapt tactics moment by moment, never committing fully to any single approach, always maintaining options for retreat or escalation. Eventually, Jango reached the slave Wan, and they launched into Kamino's stormy skies. Kenobi managed to attach a tracking device to their hull, but in the chaos of the storm and the combat, neither Jango nor Boba detected it. They thought they had escaped cleanly, heading for Geonosis, where Tyrannus had instructed Jango to rendezvous. During the journey through hyperspace, Jango seemed more subdued than usual. Perhaps he sensed what was coming. Perhaps he understood that encountering a Jedi on Kamino was not an isolated incident, but rather the opening move of something much larger and more dangerous. Geonosis was a red desert world dominated by insectoid Geonosians and massive droid manufacturing facilities. It was here that the Separatist leadership had gathered, plotting their opposition to the Republic. Count Dooku, who Boba now understood was the mysterious Tyrannus, welcomed Jango, but with a certain distance that suggested their relationship was purely transactional. Jango accepted payment and prepared to leave, but fate had other plans. Kenobi had followed them to Geonosis, and through circumstances too complex to unravel quickly, his presence triggered a cascade of events. He was captured by Dooku's separatist forces. The Republic learned of the Separatist gathering. A Jedi rescue team arrived, and suddenly Geonosis transformed into a battlefield as clone troopers. The first deployment of the army Jango had helped create descended on the planet to fight against Separatist battle droids. What followed was chaos incarnate. The Petranaki Arena, a vast circular structure designed for gladiatorial combat, became the focal point of conflict. Jedi fought against battle droids and Geonosian warriors. Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Padme Amidala, the senator whose assassination had indirectly led to this moment, fought for their lives. Jango, caught in the middle of the escalating battle, fought with the separatist forces, perhaps out of obligation to his contract, perhaps because leaving meant abandoning valuable payment, perhaps simply because retreat was no longer an option. Boba watched from the relative safety of the arena's higher levels, seeing his father enter the swirling melee below. Jango fought magnificently at first, his armor deflecting blaster fire, his weapons dispatching droids and Jedi alike. He killed several Jedi, including a Zabrak who never saw the killing shot coming, but in a reek, one of the arena's massive beasts charged into Jango during the chaos. The animal's bulk slammed into the Mandalorian, sending him sprawling. The impact damaged Jango's jetpack, the distinctive piece of equipment that had saved his life countless times, suddenly rendered inoperable. Jango recovered quickly, rolling to his feet, scanning for the next threat. That threat came in the form of Mace Windu, a senior Jedi Master whose purple lightsaber blade cut through the dust and confusion. Jango raised his blaster, firing point blank at Windu. The Jedi deflected the shot with contemptuous ease, his blade a blur of purple energy. What happened next occurred so quickly that Boba's mind almost failed to process it. Windu's lightsaber swung in a single, economical arc. The blade passed through Jango Fett's neck as though it were little more than air. Jango's helmeted head separated from his body. Time seemed to stop for Boba. The sound of battle faded to a distant roar. The only thing that existed was his father's body collapsing to the sand and his father's helmet tumbling free, empty, and accusing. 10 years of teaching, of learning, of building a future together ended in one stroke of a lightsaber. The boy who had never known anyone but his father suddenly found himself alone in a galaxy that had just revealed itself to be far more brutal than any training scenario could have prepared him for. Boba descended to the arena floor after the fighting moved elsewhere, clone troopers driving the separatist forces into retreat. He moved through the carnage in a daze, stepping over fallen droids and bodies. He reached his father's corpse and picked up the helmet, holding it against his chest. The metal was still warm. Inside, he could see the activation studs and the interior padding, all intimately familiar from the countless times he had watched Jango don and remove it. Now, it was just an artifact, a relic of someone who no longer existed. He didn't cry. Jango had taught him that tears accomplished nothing, that emotion was acceptable but must never compromise efficiency. But something fundamental shattered inside Boba in that moment. The universe revealed itself as random and capricious, where skill and caution and preparation could all be rendered meaningless by a single moment of bad luck and a Jedi's lightsaber. The lesson burned itself into Boba's psyche more indelibly than any of Jango's formal teachings. In that moment, kneeling in the sand holding his father's helmet, Boba Fett's childhood ended and something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous began to take shape. The clone troopers, wearing armor that echoed Jango's own, moved past Boba without acknowledging him. To them, he was just another casualty of the battle, another orphaned child in a galaxy full of them. But Boba was far from helpless. He made his way back to the slave Y, the ship now his by right of inheritance. He knew how to fly it. He knew where his father had cached credits and weapons across various worlds. He had the skills to survive. What he didn't have was purpose beyond a single burning objective that crystallized in the aftermath of his grief. Mace Windu had killed Jango Fett, and for that, Boba would make the Jedi pay. In the weeks following Geonosis, Boba existed in a fugue state, going through the motions of survival while his mind obsessed over a single question. How does a child kill a Jedi Master? He had seen how easily Windu had defeated his father. A direct confrontation was suicide. But Jango had taught him that strength came in many forms, that the greatest weapon was often misdirection, patience, and striking when your enemy thought themselves safe. Boba's wandering brought him into contact with others who had known Jango. The galaxy's criminal underworld maintained its own network, a sprawling web of contacts and obligations that transcended law and loyalty. One of those contacts was Aura Singh, a Paladuvan bounty hunter whose reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by her distinctive appearance. Pale skin marked by Ansati influences, a long antenna protruding from her skull, and a collection of Jedi lightsabers taken as trophies from her kills. She had worked with Jango occasionally and recognized Boba immediately. Aura found Boba on Coruscant, the Republic capital, where the boy had been surviving through petty theft and careful observation of Mace Windu's movements. She approached Boba not out of sentimentality, but because she saw potential. Jango had been a professional, and his son might prove useful. More immediately, she recognized the hate burning in Boba's eyes and understood that such hate could be weaponized. She made Boba an offer. She would help him kill Mace Windu. In return, Boba would join her crew, learn from her as he had learned from Jango, and contribute his ship and his skills to their collective efforts. Boba, desperate for any advantage and sensing his own inadequacy to achieve revenge alone, accepted. The partnership was purely transactional, devoid of warmth or genuine care. But Aura was competent, and that was enough. Aura's crew included other bounty hunters who would shape Boba's adolescent years. Bosk, a Trandoshan hunter whose species viewed Wookiees as traditional enemies and hunting trophies, brought reptilian cunning and impressive physical strength. Castus, a Klatooinian, provided connections to the Hutt clans and their extensive criminal networks. Together, they represented a cross-section of the galaxy's underworld, united by profit and survival. The plan Aura devised to kill Windu was elegant in its simplicity. Boba would infiltrate a Republic cruiser, the Endurance, by disguising himself as a clone cadet. Given that Boba was genetically identical to all the clone troopers, the disguise required minimal effort. He simply needed to act the part, to mimic the behavior of children being indoctrinated into military service. For someone who had spent his childhood on Kamino surrounded by clones, this was far easier than it might have been for others. Boba boarded the Endurance along with a group of young cadets, calling himself Lucky. The other boys, chronologically 6 years old but already beginning their training as future soldiers, viewed him with mild curiosity but no suspicion. They were children playing at war, excited by weapons demonstrations and the presence of legendary Jedi generals. Boba moved among them like a predator among prey, always observing, never fully engaging, his mind calculating angles and opportunities. Mace Windu and Anakin Skywalker were aboard the Endurance, inspecting the next generation of clone troopers. Admiral Killian commanded the vessel, overseeing operations with professional competence. The ship was massive, a Venator-class star destroyer representing the Republic's military might. Boba studied its layout, identifying escape routes and vulnerable systems. His first attempt at assassination was direct. He tried to use Jango's helmet left on the bridge as a trap, rigged with explosives. Windu and Anakin investigated the helmet, sensing something wrong through the Force. When the bomb detonated, they survived, protected by their Jedi abilities and quick reflexes. The bomb's detonation, however, damaged the ship significantly, but Boba wasn't finished. Following Aura's instructions transmitted via encrypted communication, he made his way to the reactor core. Sabotaging the reactor was more difficult, requiring technical knowledge Jango had drilled into him. Boba worked quickly, overriding safety protocols and initiating a cascade failure. Clone troopers discovered him in the act, forcing Boba to flee. He made it to an escape pod along with several other cadets, young clones who had befriended Lucky and now looked at him with confusion and betrayal as they realized he was not one of them. The Endurance's reactor exploded, sending the massive warship crashing toward the planet Vancor below. Boba watched through the escape pod's viewport as the ship burned its way through the atmosphere, breaking apart under the stress. He had just destroyed a Republic capital ship and presumably killed hundreds, possibly thousands of people. He should have felt something, triumph perhaps, or horror at the magnitude of destruction. Instead, he felt only frustration. Mace Windu had survived again. The Jedi's apparent invulnerability was maddening. The escape pod was intercepted by the slave wire, where Aura and Bosk waited. Aura looked at the other clone cadets with cold calculation. They were witnesses, living proof of Boba's involvement. She told Boba they needed to be jettisoned into space, eliminated to prevent identification. Boba looked at the clones, boys his age who had shown him kindness, and hesitated. They looked like him, sounded like him. They were technically his genetic siblings, even if he had never considered them family. Jango had taught many lessons, but murdering children in cold blood was not among them. Boba made a choice that would define him in ways he wouldn't fully understand for years. He refused to kill the cadets. Instead, he quietly apologized to them and released the escape pod into space, leaving them alive to be rescued. One of the cadets, a boy named Jax, told him he would regret betraying them. Boba said nothing, already learning that explanations were wasted on those who would never understand. Aura accepted his decision with annoyed pragmatism, though she clearly disagreed. They had bigger concerns. They had learned that Admiral Killian and Clone Commander Pons had survived the Endurance's destruction, landing on Vancor's surface along with other survivors. This presented an opportunity. Aura proposed taking hostages, using them as bait to lure Mace Windu to a location where they could finish him properly. The crew landed on Vancor, a harsh world where the Endurance's wreckage was still smoking. They found survivors taking shelter in the wreckage, injured but alive. Aura moved among them with lethal efficiency, shooting clones who posed no threat, executing wounded soldiers who couldn't defend themselves. Boba watched, disturbed, but saying nothing. This was the business his father had been in, he told himself. This was necessary. They captured Killian, Pons, and another officer, transporting them off-world to Florum, a remote planet controlled by Hondo Ohnaka's pirate gang. Hondo was an old acquaintance of both Jango and Aura, a weak-way pirate whose jovial demeanor masked ruthless pragmatism. He agreed to host them in exchange for a cut of any profits. They sent a message to the Republic, showing the hostages and demanding Mace Windu come alone or watch his men die. Days passed while they waited. The hostages were kept under guard. Boba found himself drawn to conversations with them, particularly Pons, who spoke to the boy with surprising gentleness. Pons told him that he recognized Boba as an unaltered clone, that Jango had been respected by the clone troopers even if they never knew him personally. He suggested that Jango wouldn't have wanted Boba on this path, that revenge was destroying him. Boba responded with anger, asserting that Pons knew nothing about Jango or what he would have wanted. But the words lingered, uncomfortable and accusatory in a way he couldn't dismiss. Castus, meanwhile, was growing increasingly nervous. The Klatooinian felt they had overextended themselves, that taking on Jedi would end badly. He tried to contact associates to arrange his own escape, planning to sell out Aura and the others. Aura discovered his betrayal through surveillance and executed him without hesitation, shooting him in full view of Boba. The casual violence shocked Boba more than he wanted to admit. Castus had been a member of their crew, someone they had worked alongside. His death demonstrated that loyalty meant nothing to Aura, that she would eliminate anyone who threatened her survival or profit. It was a lesson about the true nature of the bounty hunting profession, stripped of the honor codes and professional courtesy Jango had taught. When the Jedi did arrive, they sent Plo Koon and Ahsoka Tano instead of Mace Windu. This disappointed Boba, but didn't fundamentally change the situation. The Jedi infiltrated Hondo's base, moving with coordinated precision. Combat erupted throughout the facility. Aura fought Ahsoka, while Bossk engaged Plo Koon. Boba found himself in a critical moment when he captured Plo Koon, holding a blaster to the Jedi Master's head while Ahsoka held her lightsaber at Aura's throat. Aura urged Boba to take the shot, to kill the Jedi. But Boba hesitated. Killing an unarmed hostage was different from combat, different even from the destruction of the Endurance, which had been at a distance, abstract. This was personal, immediate. While he hesitated, an explosion rocked the facility. In the chaos, Aura escaped, running for the slave eye. Boba called after her, expecting her to wait for him. She didn't. She launched the ship without him, leaving him behind to be captured. The betrayal cut deeper than Boba would have predicted. He had trusted Aura, believed she cared enough to at least honor their partnership. Instead, she abandoned him the moment her own survival was threatened. Plo Koon captured Boba, taking him into custody while Ahsoka pursued Aura. The young Padawan managed to damage the slave Wara in a dogfight, causing it to crash. Aura was presumed dead in the wreckage, though Hondo would later save her. Boba found himself in Republic custody, transported to Coruscant to face justice. The charges were serious: terrorism, attempted murder of Republic officers, destruction of a military vessel. He was still a child, technically, but the Republic's laws made few allowances for juveniles who committed such spectacular crimes. In his cell, Boba met with Mace Windu one final time. Windu looked at the boy with something resembling pity. He acknowledged that Boba had chosen a dark path, that his actions had caused significant harm. But he also recognized that Boba was young, that there was still possibility for redemption. He suggested Boba could choose differently, could abandon his quest for revenge. Boba responded with cold clarity. He knew he had done wrong, but he would never forgive Windu for killing his father. Some debts, he insisted, could never be forgiven. Windu's response was terse. Boba would simply have to learn to live with that. The Jedi left, and Boba was processed into the Republic prison system. For a young boy who had spent his formative years with one of the galaxy's greatest warriors, prison was humiliating and frightening. He was surrounded by hardened criminals, protected only by his own developing combat skills and the residual reputation of the Fett name. Prison became another harsh education. Boba learned to navigate complex social hierarchies, to identify allies and threats, to survive in an environment where physical violence was common and guards often looked the other way. He met individuals who would later appear in various capacities across his career, connections forged in confinement. The experience reinforced lessons Jango had taught. Trust no one completely, always maintain awareness, never show weakness. His time in prison was relatively brief. The Republic had more pressing concerns as the Clone Wars intensified and resources for incarcerating juvenile offenders were limited. Additionally, certain parties in the criminal underworld had taken note of Jango Fett's son and saw potential uses for someone with his genetics and emerging skill set. Arrangements were made, palms were greased, and Boba found himself released after serving only a fraction of his sentence. Freedom did not bring relief. Boba emerged from prison at 13, hardened beyond his years, his childhood thoroughly shattered by loss and betrayal. He had no family, no home, no purpose beyond survival, and the dimming but never extinguished desire for revenge. The galaxy offered countless opportunities for someone with his particular skills, but all of them led deeper into the darkness his father had navigated with careful professionalism. Boba reassembled what remained of his resources. The slave I had been impounded, but was eventually recovered through the intercession of contacts in the criminal underworld. His father's accounts, hidden across various worlds, provided operating capital. He began taking small jobs, simple tracking assignments, and courier work. Building a reputation separate from his father's, he was no longer Jango Fett's son, not in any way that mattered. He was Boba Fett, a name that would eventually inspire its own legends. During these years, Boba occasionally worked with other bounty hunters, including some who had known Jango. Bosk, the Trandoshan who had been part of Aura's crew, became a sometimes partner, their relationship defined more by mutual utility than friendship. Others included Dengar, a scarred human whose Corellian roots had given him skills in slicing and piloting, C-21 High Singer, a droid assassin, and Latz Radzi, a Thelan female whose exotic appearance belied deadly competence. At one point, the group found themselves working with Asajj Ventress, a former Sith assassin turned mercenary. After being betrayed by Count Dooku, Ventress had her own complicated history with the Clone Wars and the Force-using factions that dominated galactic politics. Her presence in the crew created tension, as her motivations were never entirely clear, and her power in the Force made her dangerous in ways conventional weapons could not address. One mission brought them to work for the Jedi Quinlan Vos, who sought information on Ventress. The irony of a Jedi hiring bounty hunters to investigate another bounty hunter was not lost on Boba, but credits spent regardless of their source. He provided Voss with intelligence on Ventress, purely transactional, devoid of the emotional weight his earlier encounters with Jedi had carried. Later, in a strange inversion, he would provide intelligence to Ventress about Voss when their positions reversed. The bounty-hunting underworld was a maze of shift alliances and betrayals, where today's client might be tomorrow's target and yesterday's enemy could become a necessary ally. Boba navigated these complexities with growing skill, learning to compartmentalize personal feelings from professional obligations. The burning desire to kill Mace Windu never fully disappeared, but it receded into background noise, a long-term objective that could wait while more immediate concerns of survival and profit took precedence. As Boba entered his mid-teens, he began wearing armor more regularly. Initially, he used a customized set distinct from his father's, green and brown, with his own modifications. But eventually, he would claim Jango's actual armor, the battle-scarred Beskar his father had worn. The armor became more than protection. It became identity, a statement of lineage and capability. When people saw the Mandalorian armor, they didn't see a teenager. They saw a threat, a professional, someone to be taken seriously. His reputation grew steadily. Word spread through the underworld about a young hunter who never missed, who approached jobs with cold professionalism, who delivered targets as specified without unnecessary complications. The Fett name, which Jango had made legendary, was being rebuilt by his son through careful cultivation of similar principles. Boba was young, but youth was deceptive. He had been trained by the best, hardened by loss, educated by betrayal, and driven by a core of focused determination that made him dangerous beyond his years. Yet something remained missing, a void left by Jango's death that no amount of success could fill. Boba moved through the galaxy collecting bounties and credits, but purpose eluded him. Revenge seemed increasingly abstract, a goal that might never be achieved and wouldn't particularly satisfy even if it was. The man Mace Windu had killed was gone forever, and no amount of retribution would bring him back. This realization, when it came, was oddly liberating. If Jango was truly gone and revenge was empty, then Boba was free to define himself by his own standards rather than his father's legacy or his own grief. The Clone Wars raged across the galaxy, creating endless opportunities for those willing to profit from chaos. Boba watched from the periphery, taking jobs from both sides when it suited him, maintaining carefully cultivated neutrality. He saw the Republic's clone troopers, men who wore his father's face and died by the thousands for a cause they couldn't truly choose. He felt nothing for them, no kinship or guilt. They were soldiers. He was a bounty hunter. The distinction mattered. As the years passed and Boba approached adulthood, he began to understand something his father had never explicitly taught, but had demonstrated through example. The most dangerous weapon was not the blaster on your hip or the skills you had mastered. It was reputation. When your enemies feared you before the fight began, half the battle was already won. When clients believed you would deliver, regardless of obstacles, they paid premium rates. When other hunters heard your name and decided the target wasn't worth competing for, you worked without interference. Boba set about building that reputation with the same careful planning Jango had taught him to apply to tracking targets. Every job was completed exactly as specified. Every deadline was met. Every target was delivered in the condition the client requested. His prices were high, but his reliability was absolute. Slowly, methodically, the name Boba Fett began to carry weight in the same circles where Jango Fett had once been the unquestioned premier hunter. The boy who had held his father's helmet on Geonosis was gone, replaced by something harder and more focused. The trauma remained, buried deep, where it colored every decision and motivated every action, but it no longer controlled him. Boba Fett was becoming the most feared bounty hunter in the galaxy, and this transformation was still only beginning. The galaxy had taken everything from him. Now he would take everything he wanted from the galaxy, one bounty at a time, building a legend that would eventually eclipse even his father's. The stage was set. The hunter was ready, and the galaxy's most dangerous individuals were about to learn what it meant to have Boba Fett on their trail. The years between adolescence and full maturity shaped Boba Fett into something the galaxy had rarely seen. A hunter whose competence bordered on the supernatural, whose name became synonymous with inevitable capture, whose very presence changed the calculus of escape and survival for anyone unfortunate enough to become his target. This period, spanning the final years of the Clone Wars through the rise and reign of the Galactic Empire, saw Boba transform from a skilled teenager trading on his father's legacy into a figure of genuine legend, spoken of in whispers in cantinas across the Outer Rim, and feared by criminals and fugitives who understood that his involvement meant their freedom's end. By his late teens, Boba had fully claimed his father's armor and ship. The iconic green and red Mandalorian armor, worn and battle-scarred from Jango's countless engagements, became Boba's second skin. He modified it according to his own preferences and needs, adding weapon systems and equipment that reflected lessons learned from his own experiences. The armor was more than protection. It was psychological warfare. When targets saw that distinctive silhouette approaching, they often surrendered without resistance, understanding that fighting was futile and flight impossible. The slave Pry, that ungainly but formidable fire spray-class ship, became as recognizable as the armor. Its distinctive vertical landing position, the rotating cockpit that allowed the pilot to maintain proper orientation, the hidden weapons arrays and sensor-resistant hull plating all marked it as a hunter's vessel. Boba maintained the ship meticulously, understanding that in his profession, mechanical failure could mean death. The slave the Din's Hold had transported hundreds of captured targets over the years, its cargo, compartments modified with carbonite freezing equipment and detention systems that made escape effectively impossible. Boba's hunting methodology evolved into something approaching an art form. Unlike some hunters who relied primarily on raw physical prowess or overwhelming firepower, Boba was a strategist. He researched targets exhaustively before engaging, studying their psychology, their known associates, their preferred routes and hideouts. He cultivated information networks across the galaxy, maintaining relationships with spies, informants, and bartenders who heard everything and remembered even more when properly compensated. By the time Boba physically pursued a target, he often knew them better than they knew themselves. This preparation paid consistent dividends. Boba's capture rate was extraordinary, approaching 95% across hundreds of contracts. The targets he didn't bring in were typically those killed by other circumstances before he could reach them, not ones who successfully evaded his pursuit. Clients recognized this reliability and paid accordingly. Boba's fees were among the highest in the profession, but few clients complained. They understood they were paying for certainty, for a guarantee that the job would be completed exactly as specified. The criminal underworld operated according to codes that outsiders rarely understood. Bounty hunters occupied a peculiar space in this ecosystem, simultaneously part of the underworld and opposed to it, taking contracts from both legitimate authorities and criminal organizations, depending on who paid better. Boba navigated these complex waters with careful neutrality, never aligning permanently with any faction while maintaining professional relationships with all of them. This independence was valuable, but required constant calibration. The moment a hunter was seen as reliably working for one side, the other side would take action to eliminate a perceived threat. One of Boba's most important relationships during this period was with Jabba the Hutt, the massive Hutt crime lord who controlled much of Tatooine's criminal operations and maintained extensive influence across the Outer Rim. Jabba appreciated reliability above all else, and Boba delivered consistently. When Jabba needed someone tracked down, whether a debtor who had fled or a smuggler who had betrayed him, Boba found them. This reliability earned Jabba's favor, a valuable commodity in the underworld. Being Jabba's favored hunter meant other organizations hesitated before interfering with Boba's work, knowing that antagonizing him meant antagonizing the Hutt. Among Boba's most frequent targets were smugglers. These independent operators moving contraband across Imperial space while dodging authorities, bounty hunters, and rival criminal organizations represented a significant portion of the bounty market. The most successful smugglers combined piloting skill with social intelligence, knowing which officials could be bribed and which systems to avoid. But even the best smugglers eventually made mistakes, and when they did, hunters like Boba were waiting. Han Solo was one such smuggler, though he was hardly famous when Boba first encountered him. Solo flew the Millennium Falcon, a beat-up Corellian freighter that somehow stayed ahead of both Imperial patrols and bounty hunters through a combination of modifications, luck, and Solo's genuinely impressive piloting abilities. Solo had worked for Jabba, running spice for the Hutt, but a bad encounter with Imperial authorities had forced Solo to dump his cargo. Unable to pay Jabba back for the lost spice, Solo had become a marked man, with a substantial bounty on his head and the understanding that crossing Jabba the Hutt meant a short and unpleasant future. Boba tracked Solo occasionally during these years, but the smuggler always managed to stay one step ahead, disappearing into the chaos of the galaxy's endless conflicts. Solo had a talent for opportunistic navigation, jumping from one desperate situation into another, slightly less desperate situation, always moving, never staying put long enough for hunters to corner him. Boba recognized Solo's capabilities and filed them away mentally. This target would require more than straightforward pursuit. Solo would need to be maneuvered into a position where his usual escape routes were closed. The fall of the Galactic Republic and the rise of the Empire changed the galaxy's political landscape, but did remarkably little to alter the bounty hunting profession. The Empire needed hunters just as the Republic had, perhaps more so given the Emperor's obsession with control and order. Political dissidents, escaped criminals, rogue force users who had survived Order 66 and the Jedi Purge all represented valuable targets with Imperial bounties attached. Boba took these contracts when they interested him, maintaining the same careful neutrality he had cultivated throughout his career. The Empire paid well and punctually, virtues Boba appreciated. One particular Imperial client would prove especially significant: Darth Vader. The Dark Lord of the Sith, formerly the Jedi Knight Anakin Skywalker, represented the Empire's most terrifying enforcer. Vader commanded the Executor, a massive superstar destroyer that served as his mobile base of operations, from which he hunted Rebel Alliance leadership and Force-sensitive individuals who might threaten the Empire. Vader hired bounty hunters when situations required either deniability or capabilities his regular forces lacked. Unlike most Imperial officers who treated bounty hunters with barely concealed contempt, Vader approached them professionally. He specified objectives clearly, paid as agreed, and eliminated those who failed him. Boba first worked for Vader during the early years of the Empire, taking contracts that involved tracking Force-sensitive individuals. These jobs were more dangerous than typical bounty work because the targets possessed abilities that defied conventional tactics. Boba adapted, studying Force users and their limitations, learning to exploit the gaps between their powers and their ability to apply those powers in combat situations. Force users could sense danger and had impressive reflexes, but they could still be surprised, still be outnumbered, still be worn down through persistent pressure. Boba delivered these targets successfully, earning Vader's professional respect. The relationship between Boba and Vader was unusual for both men. Vader rarely displayed anything resembling respect toward individuals outside the Emperor's inner circle. Yet he acknowledged Boba's competence implicitly through continued employment and through small gestures, like singling Boba out in mission briefings or consulting him on matters of tracking and pursuit. For Boba, Vader represented something interesting: a client who understood lethality, who had killed Jedi just as Mace Windu had killed Jango. There was something almost satisfying about working for someone who embodied the consequences of power that the Jedi had wielded so casually. One contract from Vader proved particularly illuminating. Shortly after the Battle of Yavin, where the Rebel Alliance had destroyed the Empire's planet-killing superweapon, the Death Star, Vader tasked Boba with a specific investigation. He wanted to know the identity of the pilot who had fired the shots that destroyed the station. This was no mere bounty. This was intelligence gathering at the highest level, potentially more valuable than any single capture. Boba accepted the contract and began his investigation methodically. He cultivated sources within the Rebel Alliance's support network, bribed officials with access to Imperial intelligence, and pieced together fragmented reports from the battle itself. The investigation took weeks of patient work, sorting through false leads and contradictory information. But eventually, a name emerged: Luke Skywalker, a young man from Tatooine with no significant background, no apparent military training, yet somehow capable of a feat that veteran pilots had failed to achieve. Boba reported his findings to Vader, watching the Dark Lord's reaction carefully. Something in the information resonated with Vader beyond mere curiosity about an enemy combatant. Vader seemed almost disturbed by the name, though his mask prevented any certainty about his emotional state. Vader paid Boba generously for the intelligence and dismissed him. Boba left wondering what connection Vader had to this particular young rebel, but such speculation was above his pay grade. He had delivered the information as contracted. The client's motives were the client's business. The Rebel Alliance, that ragtag collection of individuals opposed to imperial rule, created numerous bounty opportunities. Many Alliance operatives were former criminals or individuals with existing prices on their heads even before their Rebel involvement. The Alliance's cellular structure, designed to prevent catastrophic compromise if individual cells were captured, meant that hunting rebels often involved tracking them across multiple systems while they attempted to fade into the general population. Boba took several such contracts, finding the work more challenging than typical criminal pursuits because rebel operatives often possessed military training and organizational support. Despite these advantages, few rebels successfully evaded Boba when he was specifically assigned to their capture. He understood that ideological conviction, while powerful as motivation, did not translate directly into the skills necessary to evade a professional hunter. Rebels could be brave, committed, and even tactically skilled, but most lacked the paranoia and perpetual awareness that defined successful survival in the underworld. They made patterns, maintained contact with associates, returned to familiar locations. These were all exploitable behaviors. During these years, Boba also encountered Din Djarin briefly, though neither would remember the meeting years later. Din Djarin was another Mandalorian, a foundling like Jango had been, though from a different tradition. The Mandalorian culture had fragmented over the centuries into various factions with different interpretations of the old codes. Some, like Din Djarin's sect, maintained strict adherence to certain practices like never removing helmets in the presence of others. Others, like Jango and Boba, viewed the armor primarily as functional equipment rather than religious requirement. The meeting was cordial but brief, two hunters acknowledging each other professionally before moving on. As Boba entered his 30s, his reputation reached its peak. He was consistently ranked as either the best bounty hunter in the galaxy or among the top 2 or 3, depending on who was making the list. Other hunters spoke of him with mixture of respect and resentment, acknowledging his skills while resenting his monopolization of the highest-paying contracts. Some attempted to emulate his methods with varying degrees of success. None achieved his consistency. The galaxy was vast, containing countless worlds and trillions of sentient beings. Yet in certain circles, Boba Fett's name had weight. Crime lords knew it. Imperial officers knew it. Rebel leadership knew it. Even common criminals working minor schemes on backwater worlds had heard stories about the Mandalorian hunter who never stopped, never gave up, never failed. Some of these stories were exaggerated, embellished through repeated retelling until they bore little resemblance to reality. But the core truth remained. If Boba Fett was hunting you, your best option was surrender, because every alternative ended worse. 3 years after the Battle of Yavin, opportunity knocked in the form of Darth Vader's obsession with young Luke Skywalker. The Dark Lord had become fixated on capturing the rebel pilot, driving pursuit across multiple systems. The Millennium Falcon, now famously associated with the Rebel Alliance's leadership, had become a priority target. Its crew included not only Han Solo, but also Princess Leia Organa, one of the Alliance's founders and most prominent leaders, and Chewbacca, Solo's Wookiee co-pilot. Capturing any of them would be a significant victory for the Empire. Capturing all three would be a propaganda coup. Vader summoned 6 bounty hunters to the Executor, his flagship. Boba arrived along with familiar faces. Bosk, the Trandoshan, who had been part of Aura Singh's crew years earlier. Dengar, the Corellian, whose cybernetic enhancements had saved his life after severe injuries. Forlom, a protocol droid reprogrammed for assassination. Zuckuss, a Gan Finesman who used mystical traditions alongside technology, and IG-88B, a terrifyingly efficient assassin droid. This was an extraordinary gathering, representing some of the galaxy's most capable hunters assembled for a single objective. Vader's instructions were specific, but allowed for professional interpretation. Find the Millennium Falcon, capture its crew alive, use any means necessary short of killing the targets. Vader then turned specifically to Boba and added a pointed instruction: no disintegrations. This was not arbitrary. Boba had a reputation for bringing targets in via disintegration when circumstances prevented conventional capture, a practice that technically fulfilled contracts specifying dead or alive, but frustrated clients who preferred living captives for interrogation or display. Boba acknowledged the restriction with economical professionalism. Vader was offering 20,000 credits, which was less than Boba's usual fee but came with Imperial backing and the potential for additional opportunities. More importantly, the target list included Han Solo, which meant Boba could potentially fulfill both the Imperial contract and collect Jabba's standing bounty on the smuggler. Double payment for a single capture represented excellent efficiency. The hunt began across the Hoth asteroid field, where the Falcon had fled after escaping the rebel base on the ice planet. Imperial forces scoured the asteroid field methodically, searching for the freighter among thousands of tumbling rocks. Most hunters deployed conventionally, using sensors and search patterns to cover their assigned sectors. Boba took a different approach, one that demonstrated why his fees were justified. He understood Han Solo's psychology from their previous encounters and from extensive research into the smuggler's career. Solo was unconventional, prone to unexpected tactics that defied logical prediction. He rarely did the obvious thing. Moreover, Solo was capable of truly impressive piloting and possessed a ship modified far beyond factory specifications. These factors suggested Solo would attempt something audacious rather than simply hiding in the asteroids and hoping to evade detection. Boba positioned the Slave-I not in the asteroid field, but near the Imperial Star Destroyer's garbage dumps. Imperial doctrine called for ships to dump refuse before making hyperspace jumps, preventing accumulated waste from causing complications during transit. It was a mundane detail, the kind of background procedure most people never noticed. But Boba had noticed, and he had also noticed that the Star Destroyer commanders were growing impatient, preparing to abandon the search and jump to hyperspace to pursue other leads. His patience paid off spectacularly. When the Imperial ships dumped their garbage, one particular object didn't tumble away naturally. The Millennium Falcon, which had somehow attached itself to the Star Destroyer's hull and successfully avoided detection through sheer audacity, released and drifted away among the refuse. Most observers would have missed it entirely, but Boba was watching specifically for something unusual. He identified the Falcon instantly and allowed it to depart without alerting the Imperial forces. Solo thought he had escaped. In reality, he had merely postponed capture while unknowingly acquiring an invisible shadow. Boba followed the Falcon at distance, maintaining sensor lock while staying far enough back to avoid detection. Solo eventually made for Bespin, a gas mining colony in a remote system. Cloud City, Bespin's primary settlement, was governed by Lando Calrissian, a former associate of Solo's who had turned respectable as the colonial administrator. Solo apparently believed Calrissian would provide refuge and assistance, a gamble based on old friendship. Boba reached Bespin ahead of the Falcon and made arrangements with the Empire. Darth Vader arrived shortly thereafter with a garrison force, and together they set a trap. Calrissian, faced with the choice between protecting Solo or preserving his own position and the safety of Cloud City's population, made the pragmatic decision. He betrayed Solo, leading him directly into Imperial custody. What followed was a tense negotiation between various parties with competing interests. Vader wanted Solo alive as bait to lure Luke Skywalker into a trap. Boba wanted Solo frozen in carbonite for transport to Jabba, ensuring the smuggler couldn't escape during the journey across the galaxy. Vader initially expressed skepticism about carbonite freezing, concerned it might kill Solo and render the whole operation pointless. They decided to test the process on Solo to verify its viability. Boba watched the carbonite freezing process with professional interest. Solo was lowered into the freezing chamber, his last words to Princess Leia a cynical but affectionate acknowledgement of her declaration of love. The process was brutal to observe, Solo's face frozen in a rictus of shock and pain as the carbonite hardened around him. But when they extracted the frozen block, sensors confirmed Solo was alive, merely in hibernation. The process worked. Vader turned Solo over to Boba as agreed, though the Dark Lord warned that he still expected Solo to be delivered to Jabba alive and available for Imperial purposes should they need him. Boba accepted these terms, understanding that Vader was powerful enough to retrieve Solo by force if necessary, but trusting that Boba's professionalism made such action unnecessary. Chewbacca, Solo's lifelong companion, howled in despair as Boba loaded the carbonite block onto the slave hide. Princess Leia watched with barely contained fury, already planning a rescue that she would attempt within months. The journey to Tatooine should have been straightforward. Boba had his target, secured and unconscious, with no possibility of escape. But complications arose immediately. Word spread throughout the underworld that Boba Fett had captured Han Solo, and several parties moved to intercept. Some were rival bounty hunters hoping to steal the prize. Others were Alliance operatives attempting a rescue. Still others were criminals Solo had wronged over his career, seeking revenge or hoping to collect their own bounties. Boba evaded or eliminated these threats through a combination of skilled piloting, the Slave Eye's formidable weapon systems, and tactical decision-making that kept potential attackers off balance. One particularly aggressive attempt involved the bounty hunters IG-88 and Forlom, who had worked the Bespin contract alongside Boba. They attempted to intercept the Slave Eye in deep space, presumably planning to claim Solo for themselves. Boba defeated both, destroying IG-88 systems and capturing 4-Lam's head, for later interrogation about who had contracted them for the theft attempt. Eventually, Boba reached Tatooine and delivered Solo to Jabba's palace. The Hutt was delighted, displaying Solo's frozen body as a wall decoration in his throne room, a warning to others who might consider betraying him. Jabba paid Boba's fee plus a generous bonus, solidifying their already strong professional relationship. Boba became a fixture in Jabba's court over the following months, serving as an enforcer and bodyguard, while the Hutt threw lavish parties celebrating his triumph over the smuggler who had defied him. Life in Jabba's palace was simultaneously decadent and dangerous. The Hutt surrounded himself with entertainers, sycophants, and dangerous individuals whose loyalty was maintained through payment and fear. The palace operated according to its own rules, a microstate where Jabba's word was absolute law and his displeasure meant death, often in creative and horrifying ways. Boba navigated this environment with his usual professional detachment, neither participating in the debauchery nor judging those who did. He was there to work, not socialize. During this period, Boba observed the strange ecosystem of Jabba's criminal empire. The Hutt employed various species in different roles, from the Gamorrean guards who provided muscle to the Twi'lek dancers who entertained guests to the Weequay pirates who handled enforcement in Mos Eisley in the palace's vicinity. This diversity was strategic. Different species brought different capabilities and different leverage points for control. Jabba understood personnel management at an instinctive level that many corporate executives would envy. The rescue attempt Boba had anticipated came approximately 6 months after Solo's delivery. Luke Skywalker, now more skilled with the Force than during their previous encounter, infiltrated the palace along with Leia, Chewbacca, and Lando Calrissian, who had helped with the initial infiltration before being discovered. The plan was ambitious and multi-layered, involving Lando being inserted as a palace guard, Leia posing as a bounty hunter to gain access, and eventually Luke presenting himself directly to Jabba and demanding Solo's release. Jabba, amused by the audacity and confident in his security measures, decided to execute the entire rescue party at the Great Pit of Carkoon, home to the Sarlacc, a creature whose digestive system would keep victims alive and conscious for 1,000 years, while slowly consuming them. This was Jabba's preferred method of execution for those who had particularly offended him, combining cruelty with a kind of permanence that regular death could not achieve. The execution party traveled to the pit aboard Jabba's sail barge, a massive repulsor craft that served as a mobile throne room. Boba accompanied them, partly as security and partly because watching Han Solo's final moments held a certain professional satisfaction. Solo had been a challenging target, and seeing him meet an appropriately dramatic end seemed fitting. The prisoners were to be dropped into the Sarlacc one by one, with Solo scheduled to go last so he could watch his friends die first. But Luke Skywalker had planned more carefully than Jabba anticipated. The young Jedi had hidden his lightsaber inside R2-D2, his astromech droid who had been presented to Jabba as a gift. At the crucial moment, as prisoners were being forced to walk the plank over the Sarlacc's mouth, R2-D2 launched the lightsaber to Luke. The Jedi caught it, ignited the blade, and suddenly the execution became a battle. What followed was chaos. Luke fought his way across the deck of the prisoner skiff, cutting down guards. Leia, still aboard the sail barge, used her chains to strangle Jabba, the massive Hutt dying with surprising rapidity given his bulk. Chewbacca and Lando fought guards on their skiff. The desert wind carried smoke from damaged repulsor engines and the screams of dying Gamorreans. It was precisely the kind of confused melee where individual skill mattered less than luck and position. Boba engaged immediately, using his jetpack to position himself on the deck of the prisoner skiff where Luke was cutting through guards. He fired his wrist-mounted grappling line at Luke, the cord wrapping around the Jedi's lightsaber arm and temporarily restraining it. He then raised his EE-3 carbine blaster rifle, preparing to kill the Jedi, despite knowing Vader wanted him alive. In the chaos, orders became suggestions, and a dead Luke Skywalker seemed preferable to allowing him to free Solo. But in the confusion of bodies and smoke, Solo, temporarily blind from hibernation sickness but desperate to help his friends, grabbed a vibro axe from a fallen guard and swung wildly. The blow struck Boba's jetpack at a vulnerable point, damaging the activation mechanism. The pack engaged uncontrollably, rocketing Boba up and sideways. He tumbled through the air, disoriented by the sudden acceleration, and slammed into the hull of Jabba's sail barge. The impact stunned him, and before he could recover, the malfunctioning jetpack sent him on another uncontrolled trajectory, this time directly toward the Sarlacc pit. Boba fell into the creature's mouth. He had a single moment of horrified realization before he slid past the rows of inward-pointing teeth and down into the beast's gullet. The teeth, designed to prevent prey from climbing back out, scraped against his armor, but failed to penetrate the Beskar plating. Then he was fallen into darkness, into the humid, fleshy interior of a creature that had been feeding in this desert pit for tens of thousands of years. He hit what he assumed was the stomach with bone-jarring impact, the armor absorbing most of the shock but leaving him dazed. The air was hot and thick, filled with moisture and the smell of decay. In the darkness, broken only by the faint glow of his helmet's display systems, Boba assessed his situation with the cold calculation that had been drilled into him since childhood. He was inside a Sarlacc, a creature that would keep him alive for centuries while slowly digesting him. His armor would protect him for some time, but the beast's digestive acids were already working against the seals. Eventually they would breach, and then the neurotoxins would begin their work, paralyzing him while keeping him conscious. This was not how Boba Fett's story was supposed to end. Not consumed by some mindless beast in a desert pit on Tatooine. Not after surviving childhood trauma, betrayals, decades of the galaxy's most dangerous profession, encounters with Jedi and Sith Lords and everything in between. The universe could not possibly be so random, so meaningless, as to let this be the conclusion. Boba refused to accept it. His father had taught him that surrender was never an option, that fighting until the last breath was the only honorable path. He began working to free himself, even as the Sarlacc's internal tentacles wrapped around him, attempting to secure him in place. He could hear the creature's digestive system at work around him, a rhythmic pulsing that suggested something like a heartbeat, or perhaps the mechanical working of an alien biology beyond human comprehension. His sensors detected another form near him, a stormtrooper who had fallen into the pit years earlier, judging by the advanced state of decay. The trooper's armor was being dissolved by the Sarlacc's acids, the plastoid breaking down into its component chemicals. Boba recognized this as his own future if he didn't escape soon. His armor would last longer than standard stormtrooper armor, but not forever. Eventually, the same fate awaited. The stormtrooper corpse still had an oxygen supply in its damaged suit. Boba worked to access it, needing to supplement his own air supplies. The physical effort was enormous, fighting against the Sarlacc's constricting tentacles while manipulating the corpse's equipment. But he managed to connect the oxygen feeds, buying himself more time. His next move required precision and desperate courage. He activated his suit's flamethrower, burning the Sarlacc's internal tissue in the immediate vicinity. The creature convulsed in response, its agony transmitted through the flexing walls of its digestive chamber. Boba continued burning, creating a wound in the Sarlacc's internal structure. The creature's convulsions grew stronger, its pain evident in the violent contractions of its muscles. Boba pressed his advantage, using the last of his concussion grenades to blast a larger opening through the wounded tissue. The explosions were deafening in the confined space, the shock waves hammering his body even through the armor. But the blasts achieved their objective, creating a passage through the Sarlacc's flesh toward what his sensors suggested was the surface. Climbing through a live creature's internal organs while that creature thrashed in agony tested every aspect of Boba's physical and mental endurance. The passage was slick with digestive fluids that burned any exposed skin. The creature's convulsions threatened to crush him. The darkness was absolute except for his helmet lights. But Boba climbed, driven by the same stubborn refusal to accept death that had defined his entire life since Geonosis. He had survived his father's death. He would survive this. He emerged from the sand near the Sarlacc's mouth hours later, possibly a day later, his sense of time distorted by trauma and exhaustion. The desert air, hot enough to kill an unprotected human, felt cool compared to the Sarlacc's internal environment. He collapsed on the sand, his armor's environmental systems working to cool him while medical diagnostics assessed the damage. He was alive, but severely injured. The acid had breached some seals, burning his flesh. The neurotoxins had begun their work, affecting his nervous system, and he had no idea if he retained any allies or resources. As consciousness faded, Boba saw shapes approaching across the desert. They were humanoid, but wrapped entirely in cloth, their faces hidden behind breathing devices. Tusken Raiders, the indigenous nomads of Tatooine's wastes. To most people, encountering Tusken Raiders while wounded and helpless meant death or worse. But Boba was too exhausted to care. If the Tuskens killed him, at least he would die on the surface rather than in a creature's digestive tract. That seemed marginally better. The Tusken Raiders looked down at the armored figure collapsed in the sand, deliberated among themselves in their signing language, and made a decision. Instead of killing Boba, they took him. One of them removed his armor piece by piece, stripping away the identity and protection that had defined him. Without his armor, Boba Fett was just another wounded man in the desert. The Tuskens bound him and began dragging him away from the Sarlacc pit, away from the burning wreckage of Jabba's sail barge visible in the distance, away from everything he had been. As they pulled him across the sand, Boba lost consciousness completely, his body surrendering to trauma and exhaustion. He had survived the Sarlacc, but the cost would prove significant, and the path ahead would transform him in ways he couldn't possibly anticipate. The bounty hunter who had fallen into the pit would not be the same man who eventually emerged from the desert. The galaxy would assume Boba Fett died on Tatooine. For a time, that assumption would be functionally true, even as the man himself remained technically alive, waiting in the darkness for a rebirth he had not chosen, but could not refuse. Death is not always an end. Sometimes it is a transformation, a shedding of one identity to embrace another. For Boba Fett, the Sarlacc pit marked a boundary between lives, between the man he had been and the man he would become. The galaxy believed he had died in those desert sands, and in a sense, they were correct. The legendary bounty hunter, who had operated solely according to codes of profit and professional reputation, did not survive. What emerged instead was something more complex, someone shaped not only by loss and vengeance, but also by unlikely compassion and hard-won wisdom. The Tusken Raiders, who captured Boba, were members of a tribe dwelling in Tatooine's northern dune sea, near the territory where Jabba's palace stood. These sand people, as outsiders called them, followed ancient traditions that stretched back thousands of years, long before moisture farmers and spaceports had arrived to colonize the desert world. To understand what happened to Boba during his time with the Tuskens, one must first understand these people and their culture, so often dismissed or vilified by colonizers who viewed them as primitive obstacles rather than the indigenous survivors they actually were. Tusken Raiders were not mindless savages, despite what propaganda claimed. They were a complex society adapted perfectly to Tatooine's harsh environment, with sophisticated social structures, spiritual beliefs, and survival strategies that had sustained them through millennia. They communicated through a sign language that outsiders rarely learned, their voices reserved for sacred moments. They rode banthas, massive furry beasts with which they formed deep emotional bonds, and they divided labor according to skill and need, with warriors, hunters, craftspeople, and elders all contributing to the tribe's survival. When the Tuskens captured Boba, they did not recognize him as the famous bounty hunter. They saw a wounded man in strange armor, unconscious and helpless in territory they considered sacred. The armor alone was valuable enough to justify keeping him alive for potential trade or ransom. But the Tuskens also recognized something about the armor's make, its durability, and obvious combat functionality. This suggested the man inside might possess skills worth exploiting if he survived his injuries. Boba awoke in a Tusken camp, bound to a pole alongside a Rodian prisoner. The Tuskens had stripped his armor and equipment, leaving him in the undergarments he wore beneath the Beskar plates. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, and his injuries from the Sarlacc screamed for medical attention he wasn't receiving. A young Tusken child and a massive, one of the reptilian hunting beasts the Tuskens domesticated, were assigned to guard the prisoners while the tribe went about their daily activities. The young Tusken led Boba and the Rodian out into the desert to dig for black melons, water-storing plants that grew beneath the sand. This was slave labor, the Tuskens' way of extracting value from captives while determining their usefulness. Boba, weakened by his ordeal, worked mechanically, digging where indicated. The Rodian complained constantly, whining about the heat and the injustice of their situation. Boba said nothing, conserving his strength and observing everything, always looking for opportunities to escape or turn the situation to his advantage. That opportunity came suddenly and violently. A sand creature, massive and four-armed with segmented armor and crushing mandibles, erupted from beneath the dunes, attracted by the vibrations of their digging. The beast killed the Rhodian instantly, tearing the unfortunate prisoner apart with casual brutality. The young Tuscan child stood frozen in terror as the creature advanced toward him. The Massif attempted to defend its ward but was batted aside by one of the creature's massive limbs. Boba acted without conscious thought. He still wore chains binding his wrists, but chains could be weapons if wielded correctly. He charged the sand creature, wrapping the chain around one of its arms, then used his body weight to redirect the creature's strike against itself. He dodged under another strike, wrapped the chain around the beast's thick neck, and began strangling it. The creature thrashed violently, trying to shake him off, but Boba held on with desperate strength born from decades of survival instinct. He squeezed until the creature's struggles weakened and finally stopped. Then he squeezed a while longer, making sure. When the creature finally lay dead, Boba collapsed beside it, exhausted beyond measure. The young Tuscan approached cautiously, clearly shocked by what he had witnessed. The rest of the tribe arrived soon after, drawn by the combat sounds. They looked at Boba, at the dead sand creature, and at their unharmed child. The tribe's chieftain, an imposing figure who radiated authority through posture and gesture, even with his face hidden behind traditional wrappings, approached Boba. He made signs that Boba couldn't interpret, then handed him one of the black melons. This was acceptance. Boba had proven himself worthy of respect, or at least worthy of being kept alive for more than simple labor. Over the following weeks, Boba's status in the tribe evolved. He was no longer a simple slave, but rather something like a probationary member. A female Tuscan warrior, skilled in close combat and clearly respected within the tribe's hierarchy, began training him in the use of a Gaderfi stick, the traditional Tuscan weapon combining spear, club, and axe in a single brutal implement. Training was brutal and unforgiving. The warrior would knock the stick from Boba's hands repeatedly, forcing him to retrieve it and try again. She offered no encouragement, only the practical education of muscle memory built through repetition and bruises. Boba absorbed these lessons with the same focus he had brought to Jango's training years before. The Gaderfi stick required different techniques than the weapons he was accustomed to, emphasizing leverage and precise strikes over raw force. But the underlying principles were familiar: balance, timing, awareness of distance, and angle. He practiced constantly, working through pain and exhaustion, because he understood that competence here meant survival and potentially freedom, while weakness meant death or perpetual captivity. The tribe faced a recurring problem that would ultimately determine Boba's fate among them. A Pike Syndicate hover train traveled through their territory regularly, carrying spice for distribution across the planet. The train was heavily armed, and its guards fired on any Tuscans they saw, killing indiscriminately. Several tribe members had died in these attacks, including warriors and even banthas. The tribe's traditional weapons, cycler rifles firing solid slugs, were no match for the train's armored hull and automated weapon systems. After another attack that killed more tribe members, Boba approached the chieftain and the female warrior with a proposal. He explained, through crude sign language and gestures, that he could stop the train. He would need time and trust, but he could neutralize this threat permanently. The Tuscans were skeptical, understandably, but they also recognized that their current approach was failing, that they were slowly being eliminated by a threat they couldn't effectively counter. They agreed to give Boba his chance. Boba traveled to Tosha Station, a nearby settlement frequented by various desert dwellers, moisture farmers, and the Kintan Striders, a Nikto biker gang that terrorized local settlements. Inside the cantina, the gang was harassing locals, including a couple Boba recognized as residents from his childhood memories of Tatooine before Jabba's death. The Niktos were enjoying their intimidation, secure in their numbers and weapons. Boba walked in alone, assessed the situation with a practiced glance, and began systematically dismantling them. The fight was short and brutal. Boba, even without his armor and working with injuries from the Sarlacc, was still one of the most dangerous unarmed combatants in the galaxy. He used the environment against the Niktos, smashing heads against tables, breaking limbs with precisely applied leverage, moving with the economy that suggested he was barely exerting himself. Within minutes, all the Niktos were unconscious or incapacitated. Boba appropriated their speeder bikes, loading them onto a repulsor sled, and returned to the Tusken camp. The Tuskens had never used speeder bikes before. These devices represented technology they had deliberately rejected, viewing them as corrupting influences from the colonizer culture that had invaded their world. But Boba convinced them that adaptation was survival, that using the colonizers' tools against them was practical rather than betrayal. He taught them to ride, comparing the speeders to banthas in terms of control and balance. The initial attempts were comedic, with Tuskens flying backward or spinning in circles as they struggled with throttle control. But they learned quickly, their natural coordination and fearlessness translating well to the new medium. Training took days. Boba drilled them on formation riding, on coordinated attacks, on using mirrors to signal across distances. He taught them tactics he had used in countless bounty hunting operations, adapted for group combat rather than individual pursuit. The Tuskens absorbed everything with fierce concentration, understanding that this training represented their best chance at defending their territory and avenging their fallen. When the next pike train approached, the Tuskens were ready. They attacked from both sides simultaneously, speeders allowing them to pace the train and board it while it was moving. Boba led from the front, demonstrating the tactics he had taught. The pike guards, accustomed to easy slaughter of poorly armed natives, suddenly faced a coordinated assault from mobile platforms. The battle was fierce but brief. The Tuskens overwhelmed the guards through numbers and ferocity, taking control of the train and forcing it to stop. The pike supervisor aboard the train attempted to negotiate, claiming they were simply business people traveling through the territory. Boba, now speaking for the Tuskens through the common language of Galactic Basic, explained that this was Tusken land, that the tribe was a sovereign civilization with territorial rights. The Pikes would either pay tribute for passage through Tusken territory, or they would find their trains destroyed and their personnel killed. This was not negotiable. The pike reluctantly agreed, recognizing that the alternative was worse for business. The Tuscans released the train, keeping some of the spice as immediate payment. Boba had successfully transformed the tribe's greatest external threat into a revenue source and demonstrated that adaptation could preserve tradition rather than destroy it. His status among the Tuscans reached a new level following this victory. The tribe honored Boba through a sacred ritual. They sent him on a vision quest involving a psychedelic gecko that crawled into his body through his nose, inducing powerful hallucinations. Boba experienced visions of his past, present, and possible futures, all blending together in symbolic imagery that defied literal interpretation. When he emerged from the experience, the tribe considered him fully initiated. He was now truly one of them, a Tuscan raider in all but genetic heritage. To commemorate his initiation, Boba crafted its own Gaddafi stick. The female warrior led him to a hidden workshop where ancient Tuscan craftsmen worked, showing him the proper techniques for selecting wood from the rare trees that grew in Tatooine's deepest desert regions, treating it with oils and bindings that had been perfected over generations. Boba created his weapon according to tradition, but with personal modifications that reflected his own combat style. When he presented it to the tribe that evening, they celebrated with ritual dances around a great fire, welcoming him fully into their community. For perhaps the first time since Jango's death, Boba experienced something resembling belonging. The Tuscans accepted him without reservation, viewing him as one of their own. They shared their knowledge freely, teaching him desert survival skills that went far beyond anything he had previously known. He learned to navigate by stars that were visible only in the desert's dark nights, to find water in places that seemed lifeless, to read sand patterns that told stories of wind and weather and the passage of animals and people days earlier. This was education in a different form than Jango's tactical training or Aura's ruthless pragmatism. This was community knowledge, shared for collective survival rather than individual advantage. But the happiness was fragile, built on the shifting sands of a planet where violence was always close. Boba left the camp one day to collect the pike tribute from their next train. When he returned, he found the camp destroyed. Bodies lay scattered in the sand, Tuscans and Banthas alike, slaughtered with blaster fire. One of the tents bore the painted symbol of the Kintan Striders, the Nikto gang whose bikes Boba had stolen weeks earlier. The message was clear. This was retaliation for that theft and the humiliation it represented. Boba knelt in the sand, surrounded by death, experiencing a grief that eclipsed even what he had felt when Jango died. Jango's death had been a singular loss, terrible but focused. This was wholesale, destruction of an entire community that had accepted him, that had given him purpose and belonging. The female warrior who had trained him lay among the dead, her distinctive armor scorched by blaster fire. The chieftain who had accepted him lay beside her, the young Tuscan child who had witnessed his victory over the sand creature, dead. The Banthas, those gentle giants who had watched him practice with bemused patience, slaughtered for no reason beyond cruelty. Boba gathered what remained of the tribe's weapons and possessions, stacking them on a funeral pyre according to Tuscan tradition. He lit the fire and watched as flames consumed the physical remnants of people who had been his family, however briefly. As the smoke rose into the desert night, Boba made a decision. The galaxy had taken this from him, as it had taken Jango, as it had taken everything that had ever mattered. He would take something back. He would build something that couldn't be destroyed by random violence and careless cruelty. He would establish power in a form that could protect itself and those under its aegis. This resolution took him to wandering the desert again, but now with purpose. Weeks passed as he navigated the wasteland, surviving through skills the Tuskens had taught him, combined with his own decades of experience. During one of these wanderings, near the ruins of a moisture farm, he found someone else the desert had nearly claimed. Fennec Shand lay dying in the sand, shot through the gut and left for dead by Toro Calican, a bounty hunter who had been pursuing her before being killed by Din Djarin's Mandalorian. Boba recognized Fennec's face immediately. She was one of the galaxy's premier assassins, a master marksman whose reputation rivaled his own. Her survival skills were legendary. That someone of her caliber had been left in the desert to die suggested she had been caught by surprise, a rare lapse that nearly proved fatal. Boba made a calculation. Fennec alive represented a potential ally far more valuable than anything he might loot from her corpse. He dragged her to the slave Y, which he had finally recovered from its impoundment, and sought medical attention. The medical attention came from a mod artist in a settlement near Mos Eisley, a surgeon who specialized in installing cybernetic enhancements in clients seeking to become part human, part machine. The mods were a subculture often dismissed as outcasts by conventional society, but they possessed technical skills that conventional medicine lacked. The mod artist examined Fennec's wound, which had destroyed a significant portion of her digestive system, and proposed a radical solution: replace the damaged organics with cybernetics that would provide superior functionality. The surgery took hours. Boba waited, uncertain whether Fennec would survive the procedure or whether she would blame him for saving her in a way that fundamentally altered her body without consent. But when Fennec finally woke, her first reaction was pragmatic. She assessed her cybernetic modifications, tested her mobility, and accepted the changes as necessary for survival. When Boba identified himself, she initially laughed, claiming Boba Fett was dead. Everyone knew it. Boba responded that they were both dead by reputation, both left for dead in Tatooine's sands. Perhaps that created a bond. Boba explained his proposition. He was planning to claim Jabba's former territory to become the new daimyo of Mos Espa. He needed someone with her skills, someone who understood the criminal underworld and possessed the combat capabilities to defend against inevitable challenges. In return, he would offer her protection, partnership, and a share of profits. Most importantly, he would watch her back the way she would watch his. In their profession, that kind of mutual trust was rarer than precious metals. Fennec considered the offer from practical angles. She had bounties on her head from various organizations. Her near death had eliminated some of those threats, but others would resurface once word spread that she was alive. Aligning with someone establishing a power base on a remote world offered protection and opportunity. Moreover, she respected Boba's competence, having tracked his career over the years. If anyone could successfully claim a crime lord's territory, Boba Fett could. She accepted. Their first joint operation was revenge against the Kintan Striders. Boba had done research during his desert wanderings, tracking the gang to various hangouts. Together, he and Fennec systematically eliminated the gang's leadership, hitting their bases with coordinated precision that demonstrated what two expert hunters could achieve working in concert. The attacks were brutal and uncompromising. Boba in particular showed no mercy, his actions driven by the lingering grief and rage over the Tuscans' massacre. By the time they finished, the Kintan Striders were effectively eliminated as an organized force. Their next objective required more subtlety. Boba's armor had been stolen by Jawas after his escape from the Sarlacc, eventually sold to Cobb Vanth, the marshal of a small settlement called Freetown. Din Djarin had recovered the armor during his own adventures and currently possessed it. Boba tracked Din Djarin to the ancient Jedi temple on Tython, where the Mandalorian was attempting to contact other Jedi about Grogu, the Force-sensitive child he had adopted. The meeting was tense initially. Din Djarin was skeptical of Boba's claim to the armor, viewing him as merely a clone rather than a true Mandalorian. But Boba revealed his chain code, a holographic record embedded in the armor itself that detailed his father Jango's history as a Mandalorian foundling who had fought in the Mandalorian Civil Wars. This established Boba's legitimate claim through Mandalorian tradition, which recognized foundlings as true Mandalorians regardless of blood heritage. Din Djarin, bound by his own strict adherence to Mandalorian codes, recognized Boba's right to his father's armor. What followed was an Imperial ambush as Moff Gideon's forces attacked to capture Grogu. Boba, now fully armored again, demonstrated why he was feared across the galaxy. He fought with devastating efficiency, using every weapon system in his arsenal, decimating Imperial forces with the same cold competence that had defined his bounty-hunting career. Stormtroopers fell in waves to his precise blaster fire. Those who tried to flank him were eliminated by rockets from his jetpack. His combat style was economical and brutal, wasting no motion, every action calculated for maximum effect. Despite their efforts, Gideon's dark troopers captured Grogu. Boba pledged his continued support to Din Djarin in recovering the child, honoring the debt he owed for the armor's return. This led to an assault on Gideon's cruiser, where Boba provided crucial distraction that allowed the rescue team to board. After Grogu was safely recovered by Luke Skywalker, who would train the child in Jedi ways, Boba and Fennec departed. Their debt to Din Djarin was paid. Now they could pursue their own objectives. Those objectives led them back to Tatooine and Jabba's palace. The palace had been occupied by Bib Fortuna, Jabba's former majordomo, who had claimed the throne after the Hutt's death. Fortuna's reign was marked by weakness and corruption even by criminal standards. He lacked Jabba's strategic vision and ruthless competence, allowing various factions to carve up the former empire while he grew fat on diminishing returns. The palace, once a center of real power, had become a symbol of decline. Boba and Fennec entered the palace through stealth, moving through passages Boba remembered from his time as Jabba's enforcer. They eliminated Fortuna's guards with coordinated precision, Fennec's sharpshooting complementing Boba's close-quarters combat. When they reached the throne room, Fortuna greeted Boba with surprise, having believed him dead like everyone else. His surprise was short-lived. Boba shot him without ceremony, killing the Twi'lek instantly. Then he sat on the throne, Fennec at his side, claiming the seat of power he had once protected for another. Boba Fett was now the daimyo of Tatooine. The transition from bounty hunter to crime lord required different skills than Boba had spent his life developing. Hunting targets involved tracking, combat, and capture. Ruling territory involved politics, economics, and the complex management of various competing interests. Jabba had made it look effortless, but Jabba had been raised in Hutt culture, educated from birth in the arts of manipulation and control that their species had perfected over millennia. Boba was learning as he went, making mistakes and adjusting strategies based on outcomes. His first challenge was establishing legitimacy. Various parties had claims on Jabba's former territory, from other Hutt clans to local gangs to the remaining captains from Jabba's organization. Boba invited them all to pay tribute and acknowledge his rule. Some came willingly, recognizing practical reality. Boba Fett was famous enough that his mere presence intimidated most potential rivals. Others tested him, sending assassins or attempting political manipulation to undermine his position. The Order of the Night Wind, a guild of assassins, attempted to kill him outside the sanctuary, a cantina in Mos Espa. Boba survived the attack with Fennec's help and his Gamorrean guards, who had pledged loyalty after Fortuna's death. The assassination attempt revealed that Mayor Mok Shaiz, Mos Espa's ostensible legitimate leader, was working against him, though the mayor denied this when confronted. This was the nature of criminal politics. Everyone maneuvered against everyone else while maintaining deniability. More significantly, Jabba's cousins, a pair of Hutts known as the Twins, arrived claiming inheritance rights to their cousin's territory. They brought with them Black Chrysanthemum, a Wookiee gladiator and bounty hunter whose reputation for violence was well established. The confrontation between Boba and the twins was tense, each side posturing while calculating whether conflict was worth the cost. The twins eventually withdrew, not out of fear of Boba, but because someone else had warned them away, a mystery that would eventually reveal itself as the machinations of the Pike Syndicate. The Pikes, that same spice cartel whose train Boba had raided with the Tuskens, were establishing operations on Tatooine. They wanted to use the planet as a major distribution hub for their spice trade, and they were willing to eliminate anyone who opposed them. This put them in direct conflict with Boba, who remembered the Tuskens and their massacre, which he now suspected was Pike work, rather than the Kintan Striders. The coming conflict was inevitable. Boba prepared for war by recruiting soldiers. He enlisted the Mod Gang, young outcasts whom he had initially pursued as thieves, but came to respect for their loyalty to each other and their willingness to fight. He recruited Black Chrysanthemum after the Wookiee impressed him in an attempted assassination that Boba survived through combat skill and the intervention of a rancor he had acquired. He met with the various crime families that controlled different sectors of Mos Espa, attempting to forge an alliance against the Pikes. The crime families agreed to remain neutral, which was better than open opposition, but still left Boba significantly outnumbered. He reached out to Din Djarin for reinforcement, and the Mandalorian agreed to help, honoring their developing friendship. Din Djarin also recruited reinforcements from Freetown, the settlement where Cobb Vanth served as marshal. These were citizens rather than professional fighters, but they understood that the Pike spice trade would destroy their communities, and they were willing to fight. The Battle of Mos Espa became the defining moment of Boba's reign as daimyo. Pike forces attacked throughout the city, while the crime families Boba had courted revealed their betrayal by attacking his forces from behind. Boba fought in the streets, leading from the front as he had always done, but now defending a community rather than hunting a target. The shift in perspective was subtle but significant. He wasn't fighting for profit or reputation. He was fighting for something larger, for the right to protect people who had placed their trust in him. During the battle, Boba encountered Cad Bane, the legendary Duros bounty hunter who had mentored Jango Fett and worked with him occasionally. Bane was working for the Pikes, having taken their contract despite his past connection to the Fett legacy. Their confrontation was personal for both. Bane taunted Boba about the Tuscans' massacre, revealing that the Pikes had orchestrated it specifically to hurt Boba and discourage his interference. This information, while devastating, also clarified things. Boba's grief now had a specific target, and the battle became personal in ways that transcended mere territorial control. Bane was faster on the draw than Boba, getting a shot off first that wounded him significantly. But in the exchange of fire, Boba managed a hit with his Gatterfee stick, the Tuscan weapon he had crafted during his initiation. The symbolism was potent, defeating a representative of his old life, using a tool from his new life, bridging the two identities into something unified. Bane fell mortally wounded, his legendary career ending in the dust of a backwater world at the hands of someone he had dismissed as merely Jango's clone. With Bane eliminated and Pike leadership killed by Fennec in a separate operation, the battle turned in Boba's favor. The remaining Pike forces withdrew, the crime families that had betrayed him sued for peace, and Mos Espa settled into uneasy stability under Boba's rule. The victory came at significant cost, with many of Freetown's volunteers killed and parts of Mos Espa damaged. But Boba had successfully defended his territory and established himself as daimyo in more than name. In the aftermath, Boba began the complicated work of actual governance. He established different policies than Jabba had maintained, ruling through respect rather than pure fear, attempting to balance the needs of various communities with the practical requirements of maintaining control in a criminal ecosystem. This was difficult work, requiring constant negotiation and the occasional demonstration of force to remind everyone why crossing him remained inadvisable. His relationship with Fennec evolved into genuine partnership. They trusted each other completely, something neither had experienced often in their violent professions. Fennec handled much of the diplomatic work, her sharp intelligence complementing Boba's more straightforward approach. Together, they navigated the complex politics of Tatooine's criminal underworld while maintaining connections to the larger galaxy through contacts like Din Djarin. Reflecting on his journey from the cloning cylinders of Kamino to the throne of Mos Espa, Boba could recognize how profoundly he had changed. The boy who had held Jango's helmet on Geonosis had been defined entirely by loss and desire for revenge. The teenager learning to hunt had been driven by survival and the need to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. The adult bounty hunter had achieved mastery of his profession but remained emotionally isolated, trusting no one and connecting with nothing beyond contracts and credits. The man who now ruled Mos Espa carried all those previous versions within him, but had added something new: the capacity for genuine loyalty, and the understanding that power without purpose was ultimately empty. The Tuskens had taught him that community could matter more than individual achievement, that belonging had value beyond tactical advantage. Fennec had shown him that partnership based on mutual respect could accomplish more than mercenary cooperation. Din Djarin had demonstrated that principles could coexist with pragmatism, that honor was more than simply completing contracts as specified. These lessons did not make Boba soft. He remained one of the most dangerous individuals in the galaxy, capable of devastating violence when circumstances required it. His combat skills had not diminished. His strategic thinking had arguably sharpened through the challenges of governance. Anyone who mistook his attempt to rule through respect rather than pure fear for weakness learned their error quickly and painfully. But the violence now served larger purposes than simple profit or professional pride. Boba's legacy was complex and multifaceted. To many in the galaxy, he remained the legendary bounty hunter, feared and respected in equal measure. Stories circulated about his captures, his escapes, his victories against overwhelming odds. Younger hunters studied his techniques, trying to emulate his success. Criminals everywhere knew that if Boba Fett was hunting them, their best option was surrender, because all alternatives ended worse. But on Tatooine, he represented something different. To the citizens of Mos Espa, he was a leader attempting to bring order to chaos, someone trying to protect communities against exploitation by larger criminal organizations like the Pike Syndicate. To the mods and other outcasts he had recruited, he was a patron who offered them purpose and protection when conventional society had rejected them. To Fennec, he was a partner and friend, someone who had saved her life and earned her absolute loyalty. To Din Djarin, he was an ally bound by shared Mandalorian heritage and mutual respect, someone who could be called upon in times of need. The armor he wore carried decades of history. Each scar on the Beskar plating represented a battle fought, a contract fulfilled, a moment of survival against odds that should have been fatal. The green and red coloring, weathered and faded from years of exposure to hostile environments, had become iconic, instantly recognizable across the galaxy. When Boba walked through Mos Espa's streets, people gave him space not just from fear, but from respect. He had earned his position through demonstrated competence and by actually defending the territory he claimed to rule. His ship, the Slave the Thrall, remained his most trusted companion, the vessel that had carried him across the galaxy for decades. He renamed it at some point, a symbolic gesture reflecting his changed circumstances, though the ship's capabilities remained the same. It sat ready in the palace hangar, maintained perfectly, always prepared for whatever missions might arise. Boba was a crime lord now, but he was still a hunter at heart, still someone who preferred direct action to passive administration. The future held uncertainties. Ruling a territory brought challenges different from hunting bounties, but no less dangerous. Other criminal organizations would continue testing Boba's resolve. The Empire had fallen, but the remnants remained dangerous and unpredictable. The New Republic was attempting to establish itself, but lacked the infrastructure to maintain control across the galaxy's vast distances. In this power vacuum, individuals like Boba who could claim and defend territory had opportunities, but also faced constant threats from those seeking to expand their own influence. Boba maintained his connection to Din Djarin, and through him remained peripherally aware of larger galactic events. The Mandalorians were reclaiming their homeworld. Force users were reappearing after decades of imperial suppression. Various factions were maneuvering for position in the post-imperial landscape. Boba watched these developments with professional interest but remained focused primarily on Tatooine. He had learned through bitter experience that attempting to control more than you could actually defend led to catastrophe. Better to rule one world effectively than claim dozens worlds nominally. The nightmares came less frequently now, though they never disappeared entirely. Boba still dreamed of Geonosis, of watching his father's head separate from his body. He dreamed of the Sarlacc's interior, that claustrophobic horror of being slowly digested while conscious. He dreamed of finding the Tusken camp destroyed, of gathering bodies for the funeral pyre. These traumas had shaped him, scarred him in ways that no Bacta treatment could heal, but they no longer controlled him. He had integrated them into his identity, rather than being consumed by them in quiet moments, which came rarely in the complicated business of ruling Mos Espa. Boba sometimes wondered what Jango would think of his path. Would his father approve of his son becoming a crime lord rather than continuing the bounty hunting tradition? Would Jango understand the value of community that Boba had discovered with the Tuskens? These questions had no answers. Jango was decades dead, his opinions forever frozen in the moment Mace Windu's lightsaber ended his life. Boba could only hope that he was honoring his father's memory through his actions, living according to principles Jango had taught, even as he applied them to situations Jango had never anticipated. The galaxy remembered Boba Fett as the most feared bounty hunter of his era, and that reputation remained accurate. But the complete story was more complex, encompassing not just his hunting prowess, but also his capacity for growth, his ability to survive impossible situations through sheer stubborn refusal to die, and ultimately his transformation into something beyond a simple mercenary. He was a hunter, yes, but also a leader, a protector, and someone attempting to build rather than merely capture or destroy. As Boba stood on the palace balcony overlooking Mos Espa, watching twin suns set over the desert that had nearly killed him, he could acknowledge a certain satisfaction with how events had unfolded. The road had been brutal. The costs had been enormous. The scars, both physical and psychological, would never fully heal. But he had survived when everyone assumed him dead. He had built power when he had nothing. He had found purpose when revenge and profit had proven empty. The boy from Camino, the orphan from Geonosis, the hunter who fell into the Sarlacc, had all contributed to creating the man who now ruled this world. The galaxy would continue its endless churn of conflict and change. New threats would emerge. Old enemies would resurface in unexpected ways. But Boba Fett had learned something essential through his decades of violent experience. Survival was not enough. Purpose mattered, community mattered, and sometimes the most dangerous thing a man could do was care about something more than himself. Boba had learned to care, and that made him more dangerous than ever before because now he had something worth protecting, something worth fighting for beyond simple contracts and credits. His story was far from finished. There would be more battles, more conflicts, more challenges to his rule and his life. But Boba Fett had faced every challenge the galaxy had thrown at him and survived them all. He had transformed from a child defined by loss into a legend defined by competence, and finally into a leader attempting to create something lasting in a galaxy that destroyed more than it built. Whatever came next, he would face it the way he had faced everything since Geonosis, with cold calculation, devastating skill, and the stubborn determination that had always been his greatest weapon. If you enjoyed this journey through the complete history of Boba Fett, please consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into Star Wars lore. Hit that like button if you found this exploration of the galaxy's greatest bounty hunter fascinating, and leave a comment letting us know what other characters or events from the Star Wars universe you'd like us to cover. From clone to hunter to daimyo, Boba Fett's story is one of transformation, survival, and ultimately finding purpose in the most unlikely places. May the Force be with you always.